To begin, my name is Julia Christensen Hughes, and I'm the founding dean of the Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph in Canada, just outside Toronto. And it's it's an honor to have been asked to facilitate today's incredibly important session on the need to transform rankings. That's long been a passion of mine. I'd also like to congratulate Meta and the new board, Nikolai and his team, for enabling us all to come together to continue to share and learn from one another at this really critical time. In terms of the organization of this panel, we only have 45 minutes, including time for questions and comments from all of you. So we'll have to stay focused. Each of the panelists has been asked to introduce themselves, make opening remarks about their ranking. So they've been allotted 3 minutes each, and that will be followed by what I'm calling a lightning round of questions. We've got 3 questions, which they'll each have a minute to respond to. And then that will make sure there's time at the end for engagement with all of you. So please do make full use of the chat function to post your comments, your reactions, your questions, and then I'll be scanning, and all the panelists will be scanning to give us an opportunity to respond at the end. In terms of my own introduction, what I wanted to share is that when I first became dean, my college, a newly formed college of management and economics, embarked on a really critical strategic planning exercise. And the bottom line is we committed to a vision of being and developing leaders for a sustainable world. And one thing I've learned as an administrator is, as the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I share that. It's a proverb that I first heard from New Jersey Senator Cory Booker at the Democratic National Convention in 2016. And he attributed it to African wisdom. And I'm thinking that this is something we all might think deeply about just now as we endeavor to refocus our business schools and the rankings, particularly given the dual essential challenges that we're facing with COVID and matter movement, as well, of course, making progress towards the UN goals. But anyway, with that proverb in mind, at Lang, we decided that in order to achieve our vision, we needed to formally engage with leading international and other business school deans, such as the GRLI, the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative, and of course, Prime. And I'm really proud to say that Lang has been an active Prime champion since that was a possibility. And we've learned so much, and it's really enabled our progress. The other thing I learned as dean is what a profound impact rankings can have on perceived quality and the credibility of your business school. So as a new dean at a new school, I was working hard at brand building and fundraising, and it quickly became apparent to me that for my school and for me personally to succeed, I had to figure out how to get us ranked. So we didn't want to compromise our vision or our values in the process. So we analyzed the metrics of each of the major rankings and quickly concluded that corporate Knights was the best for us. Twice now, our MBA in sustainable commerce has been ranked in the top 20 in the world. So this was huge for us on our journey, again, in terms of credibility raising, and led to considerable additional success, including achieving the largest single gift in the university's history that resulted in us named. And I see Andrew's just to join us. That's terrific. Hi, Andrew. I wanted to add, for the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of facilitating the Dean's Dialogue at Davos, where we focused on the need to create further change in the rankings in order to make sure the metrics are incenting the kinds of behaviors, the kind of priority setting in business schools that the world so desperately needs. And we've been hearing over the last day and a half about the need for significant transformation in our business schools, and that we all have to start thinking like social activists. So the link has been listed under Nikolai's name. It came out of Davos. I want to acknowledge that Andrew Jack was able to join us there, and we also had representation from Times Higher Ed and QS as well, in terms of engaging in that fulsome discussion and being able to celebrate some of the progress being made. I also finally want to acknowledge that the panel is focused on long-standing rankings and the pivots they are making, and additional pivots or changes we'd love to see them make, again, in the spirit of systems thinking and alignment. But that the positive impact rating, which we also celebrated in Davos, the launch of that this past year, which actually recognized many Prime champion schools and members of the Prime organization, is a new rating. And I've asked Katrin, if you missed the session yesterday that highlighted that contribution, I've just asked Katrin to post a link to that as well. So with all of that said, I now turn to the panel to please provide your 3-minute opening statements. And I think as panelists, we all have the power to mute one another. So just be forewarned, at the 3-minute mark, we can all mute each other. So, so please do. And Ben, I thought we would start with you. Welcome, Ben. Haven't met you before, but it's a pleasure to have you on the panel.
Thank you very much, Julia, and to Prime for inviting us to participate in today's panel. I'm going to jump straight into it, because 3 minutes is not very long to talk about all the things we can talk about. My name is Ben Sowter. I've been at QS since 2002. We're most well known for the QS World University rankings that have been running since 2004, but we've been running business school rankings in some form for even longer than that, and more recently on a multifaceted, more detailed basis, program by program, so of MBA, Master's Business Analytics, Master's in Finance, and so forth. And as a result, we've been having some really interesting conversations with business schools and with prospective students over the past few years about what they consider important, what's valuable, what they understand, how we can talk to them about what those factors are. As the rising interest in the SDGs and sustainability and the Extinction Alliance for us in London and Greta Thunberg hitting the headlines, and young people striking from school and really beginning to value many dimensions that relate to what we're talking about now have emerged, we've been looking at them closely. And our first thing, the first thing that we decided to do is to try and get our own house in order. So we became a certified carbon neutral company last year. We're working with an organization called World Merit to tell stories more effectively about what young people are doing related to the SDGs. When it comes back around to the rankings, what we've found is that they're an exceptionally effective framework for explaining what's important in the world today to people who already care about what's important in the world today, people who are already engaged with them, people who already understand the language. And rankings have got an elevated responsibility from there, not only to speak to people who know what they're looking for, but to try and help people who don't yet know what they're looking for figure out what's important. So what we've been looking at specifically is not so much how we can build a huge range of indicators that relate to numbered SDGs into the rankings, but perhaps how we can cluster them into themes that self-evidently matter to people that may not have read the SDGs directly and may not be familiar with the framework, but resonate with them specifically. And we're in the process of building filters and ways to interrogate our data so that we can maintain their inclusivity and encourage both institutions and students who may not be familiar with the language that everybody at this event are sharing so freely to engage and discover important things that we know they're going to need to know for their future, but for many of them, they may not yet fully understand. Thank you.
So much, Ben, and really appreciate your comments about the need to not only rank others, and it's the same as business schools. It's not just to do research about others, but it's also to look in our own mirror and to think about the organization and the priorities internally, right? So that we're being consistent with that. I also wanted to share, had a brief conversation with Daniel Kahn. I was distressed to see that a Canadian magazine had grabbed hold of the recent QS University rankings, misunderstood, suggested it was a top 10 ranking of Canadian business schools, and suggested to young people that if they wanted to build their own empire, that these were the schools that they should go to. And I just thought that was so unfortunate. And it just shows how the rankings can be misunderstood, right? In terms of what they mean, the values they're trying to project, and the kinds of thinking that we want to encourage amongst young people. Anyway, thank you. Duncan, how about from you?
Thank you very much, Julia. So my name's Duncan Ross. I'm from Times Higher Education, not anymore associated with the Times, it must be said. So the approach we've taken is somewhat different to the approach that Ben's taken. Firstly, I'd say we don't currently have a ranking explicitly focused on business schools. What we have done, though, is we've looked to build out a mechanism for understanding the work that universities and from next year also postgraduate institutions are doing explicitly around the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's our opinion that actually the Sustainable Development Goals are an excellent framework for understanding sustainability, not just because they look at what you might view as the traditional green concepts, the traditional operational aspects, but also importantly because they build in aspects of equity and equality. We can't sit back as largely representatives of the global north of wealthy nations and say we're in a position to do all these good things and we can't allow development elsewhere because otherwise we would be not able to grow sustainably. We need to understand how everyone across the world can grow and can grow sustainably and can build in aspects of equity and equality as well. So we created in 2019 what we call our impact rankings. It's a one-to-one matching against the Sustainable Development Goals with an overall ranking as well. For each of the Sustainable Development Goals, we've had to try and understand how higher education institutions can map what they do to those goals, because the goals, after all, were not designed for HEIs at all. They were designed for, well, they were designed for everyone, but they don't have specific HEI elements in them. So we've adopted a theory of change. We believe that HEIs can, and business schools being part of that, can have a direct impact towards the Sustainable Development Goals in four broad aspects. Firstly, obviously through research. If you do good quality research that directly addresses the goals, that's brilliant. Secondly, through what we call stewardship, how you look after your resources, both physical resources, but also very importantly, human resources. The third aspect is outreach, the work that HEIs are doing directly in their communities, or indeed more broadly in their regions and their countries. And the fourth aspect, which is, I think, key to PRME's goals, has always been around education and teaching, making sure that the next generation of leaders can take sustainability with them into their roles in work later on. So we've built that out. We have 860 universities participating from across the world. Significantly, we're seeing growth from universities that haven't traditionally had access to rankings, that haven't actually been made visible. And we think that's really important because we believe that higher education across the world has some fantastic stories to tell about the work they're doing, but they haven't always been given the visibility that they deserve for the work they're doing. So that's it. I'll keep that short and let Julia pass on to the next victim.
Great. I really appreciate your commitment to global representation. I think that traditionally the rankings have preference, particularly through the journals, sort of the Western journals, and so important that we recognize the innovation that's happening all around the world, particularly in the global South. So thank you so much for that. Andrew, how about you next?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. So the initial remarks then are a little bit about what was unique about each of our different rankings. So in terms of the FTs, what I'd say, first of all, is they've got a very long track record. They've been around, particularly the MBA ranking, for something like 20 years now. They're quantitative, so they're very much driven by measurable things and ones that we've tried to consider as objective rather than as qualitative or subjective as possible. They're audited, so there's some degree of external credibility and verifiability about them. And they try to focus on, if you like, the value added. So they focus primarily on outcomes rather than inputs or throughputs or processes, which we think are more rigorous as ways to really see and serve, first and foremost, those who are considering studying business degrees, as well as, of course, recruiters, business schools themselves, and the wider stakeholder groups. We've long considered various aspects of some of these areas of responsible education or sustainability. The one I'd particularly focus on is diversity. So we've long measured notably the gender balance in students, in faculty, and in leadership of business schools. And we've also long given a prime to international representation, again, students and faculty and leadership. So they've long been standing, and more recently we've introduced a category to look at sustainability, particularly in the context of what's offered and what's taken up in teaching. So what aspects, what number of hours students have access to questions around climate change, sustainability, the environment. Going forwards, Ben and Duncan have talked about this as well, but the FT is very much kind of focused on what we call our new agenda, which is about purpose as well as profits and people and their role in capitalism and society going forwards. We've got a special division called Moral Money. We've launched a number of different other initiatives editorially which focus on a lot of these key issues. And we're going through a process at the moment of reflection about our methodologies for rankings to certainly incorporate, as far as is possible, more of these factors. My final point would be, though, we're still very keen to ensure we can capture things that are measurable and that are impactful. And so I think the SDGs are a very good starting point, but just to draw some parallels with, for example, ESG investing, there are thousands of different proprietary tools and metrics and frameworks that are out there. A lot of them don't, frankly, overlap very well. They serve the benefits often of those who put them forward. There's very little consensus about what meaningfully, consistently can be used to measure them. An example, lots of companies would say, well, I'm in, let's say, the pharmaceutical sector, I'm providing life-saving drugs, therefore I'm doing good and I'm meeting, the SDGs around health. Others would say I'm meeting the SDGs around, economic benefits, I pay taxes, I'm creating jobs. But as we know, of course, many of those may be charging high prices, they may be exploiting labor, they may be doing various sort of tools to avoid taxes in key markets where they operate. So I think we've got to be very careful to ensure consistent metrics that really represent in the round social impact. And I think my challenge to this whole community, and particularly the business schools, is come up with measures that are consistent, that can be measured, that do show genuine impact and output, and don't just provide piecemeal process indicators that don't necessarily actually drive the greater good more generally.
Thank you, Andrew. So a couple of comments there. Andrew is, kindly reminding us that many of the rankings that are referred to as business school rankings are actually MBA rankings. And for many business schools, the MBA is actually a very small portion of the activity of the school, often with huge undergraduate numbers, for example. And then the other I'll just pick up on is his invitation. So I see that there aren't many comments happening in the chat function. So please do take advantage. This is your opportunity to share your thoughts with these leading rankings. So maybe you can comment on something positive that you heard, some changes that are occurring that you really applaud, and also some suggestions for further change, and in particular, what metrics would you love to see? So thanks, Andrew, for that. And now over to Toby Heaps.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to the fellow panelists and everybody at the session for joining. So I'm Toby Heaps, the CEO of Corporate Knights. We're a research and media organization that publishes Corporate Knights magazine. That's Knights with a K. It's we're distributed in the Washington Post newspaper and also in Canada's Globe and Mail. So fairly broad reach within North America, and then digitally through our website. we have a global presence. In terms of the rankings and our general focus, we're myopically focused on the holistic issue of sustainable development, as it pertains to business and as it pertains to business schools. So we are, I believe, the only broad global ranking that is holistically focused on grading the sustainable development attributes of business schools. And up to recently, we've just done MBA schools. And this year we'll be adding BCom's undergrad programs as well in Canada, and then including the prime champion schools that have BCom programs. In terms of the history of the ranking, we've been doing it like the Financial Times for close to 20 years now. And we include a fairly broad sample of schools, all of the schools that qualify for the FT 100 as sort of the leading kind of schools. And then we invite schools from around the world. Anybody who wants to participate that's an accredited business school can participate. And in participation means we collect the information at Corporate Knights, and we rely just on objective indicators and a methodology that we insist passes a test for radical transparency, meaning that somebody could download it and apply it and get the same results that we got. So we give all the information and with the intent for that being possible. Because within these areas of sustainability, as Andrew was touching on, there's a lot of opportunities for greenwash and different things like that. So we try to be as meticulous and thorough as possible. At the moment, the only things that we've been able to find that you can objectively measure that are material to the experience of a student at a school are the core courses. So we can comb through the prospectuses of the core courses and ascertain if in the course description, a couple paragraphs, are they paying heed to the relevant elements of sustainable development? It's possible schools could game that, but it's a high level indicator for the courses. And to date, it's been a fairly robust one. But as we move forward, we'll need to find more robust measures for identifying the extent of integration for sustainable development themes within the core courses. The other thing we look at is institutes and chairs. How many endowed institutes and chairs are there at a school? Up to a maximum of 5. So it's not something that's going to disadvantage small schools. Just as that's a small weight indicator. The majority of the weight we place is on the most robust data set that is out there. That's on the faculty publications. It gives a really good insight to what faculty is focused on. So we look at over 150 selected mainstream and sustainable development focused journals to see how many publications the faculty at a school has made on sustainable development relevant themes over the past calendar year, and how many citations that work has achieved, and then we normalize it by faculty. So that's a way of getting at sort of what the extent of research going on is at schools. It's not a perfect way of going about it, but it's a fairly robust way. And then the other thing we look at is, like the FT, we look at the diversity of the faculty. Up until recently, we just look at the gender diversity, but starting last year, we introduced a racial diversity. So we're looking at the percent of faculty that are from a visible minority, and have implemented various nuance into that to take into account so we're not disadvantaging South African schools for having a Black professor is one example. In terms of, I guess, what we're trying to achieve with the ranking, it's been pretty clear from day one when we started doing this in 2003. We want this to be a resource for students who are looking for business schools that will help them change the world for the better, to make a better world. So students are our primary audience. The secondary audience are the schools themselves, the deans and the professors, and they're important stakeholders, their donors, including their donors. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a feedback mechanism, a transparent feedback mechanism, to reinforce those who are making progress and leading, and then to be a bit of a nudge in the back of those who are not. If you don't want to participate in our ranking, you don't have the option not to participate. If you're one of the FT 100 schools, we consider them systemically important, and we grade the schools no matter if they want to be participating or not. And so there's a bit of an accountability measure there as well. In terms of recent changes, the 2 changes I wanted to mention is the racial diversity of the faculty, implementing that, a bit of a minefield, but I believe we've found a good way of doing it, and it's detailed in the methodology. And then this year we're bringing back the undergrad programs in Canada and from the Prime Champions. So that's I'll maybe pause there and back to you, Julia. Thank you.
Toby, I didn't know you were moving into the undergraduate to the BCom degree. I've been thinking about for a while now, so I'm really excited to hear that. So thanks for that. And I also see that as you were presenting, there was some great conversations going between, how many have we got? Almost 100 participants on the line here, and the other panelists. So, and I see a main theme being about qualitative measures, saying that there's a lot of richness in qualitative. And I think there was a comment that said, we'd rather be, somewhat right than 100% wrong or something like that. There was or relevant, I guess was the point. Anyway, thanks for that. Okay, perfect. Now on to the lightning round. So the way this is going to go, I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to call on someone to answer randomly, and then you've got a minute to answer, and then you pass the baton. So call the next name. So it's going to be up to each of you, the order of these. Okay, so here's the first question. In your experience, how has your ranking or your particular metrics impacted business school priorities for better or worse? And Duncan, I don't know if for you want to think about the university more generally. Anyway, we know, right, that metrics matter. Metrics get attention. I've heard over and over again, unbelievable influence in terms of how faculty think and what they prioritize based on the ranking. So we'd love to hear from you. So Duncan, why don't you kick it off? In your experience, how has your ranking and your particular metrics impacted business school priorities for better or worse?
Well, as you said, Julia, I'll take the slightly wider view of universities. There are a number of ways that can happen. So firstly, obviously, the ability to socialize and make visible some of the work that is already being done. Excellence of work is often not given the visibility it needs. But more importantly, two things. Firstly, by pulling data that is often distributed across an organization through the president or the dean's offices, so that it becomes more part of the strategic decision-making process, particularly for universities, which can be huge. That information is often scattered. Sustainability hasn't always been part of the core. But also we're starting to see universities who are using the outputs as a mechanism for putting a stake in the ground and saying, we are committed to this. We're committed to sustainability. And the best example we've got is, I think, probably Michael Crow from Arizona State University, who explicitly said that. He said, this is not just about doing well or doing badly. This is about our commitment as an institution to sustainability. So I'll pass the baton on, I think, to Toby.
Sure. Thanks, Duncan. So because of our, I'll list a couple of examples. Because we insist on including the systemically important schools, even if they don't want to be included, in terms of how we've sometimes had a negative impact when we have done that. We've had a school that was in the middle of doing a complete sort of reappraisal of their course curriculum and strategy for their institutes and chairs. And they ended up getting they didn't want to be included, but we did include them, and they ended up getting a poor score. And it ended up angering one of their major benefactors, which they told us was unhelpful in their journey. And so it kind of hit home that when you're doing a ranking, even when you have the best of intentions, you have to be careful, and sometimes there'll be unintended consequences. And so we really try to be aware and provide the qualitative editorial context where possible to try and mitigate against that. On the positive side, it's really been interesting. Over the past number of years, I've had increasing numbers of interactions with deans who tell me that the ranking is a sort of it's one of the things that they look at along with their directors and governors, and it's something that is more of a priority, not because of our organization, but because of the importance of sustainable development and how this has become a differentiator for sourcing donor funds from major philanthropists and contributors. And I think I know we have Mr. Hoffman here today, who's made a generous contribution of around 40 million euro to INSEAD to help make business a force for good. It's just one example of that. And Julia as well, interestingly, one of her parting acts is dean at the University of Guelph, Gordon Lane School, was to raise 21 million Canadian dollars for a new sustainable building to really power forward on their sustainability leadership. And I understand that the high rankings that they had achieved on the Better World MBA rankings was something that helped to seal the deal. You look around the world, Jeff's school and his foundation have contributed $16 million to the Said School of Business at Oxford. And so you're starting to see the big money is starting to follow the schools that do well. these rankings on sustainable development in general. And so that's I think that's a really interesting trend. So, you know, when folks like Andrew and the FT have positive editorial or call outs on some segments of the rankings around this stuff, this is becoming a powerful proof point for the universities, for the business schools to raise more money. So that's I think a pretty interesting trend. Andrew?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, first of all, I think anecdotally, we certainly hear often examples of people being potentially hired or promoted partly on the basis of rankings and positioning of particular schools or particular journal articles, for instance. So there's no doubt that it does have a role. I've seen a number of external polls of college recruiters and students that certainly suggest rankings overall are a big part of their decision-making process. And why is that? And I think it's a sort of justification, if you like, for rankings, because coming back to all the discussion here about qualitative measures and more descriptive activities, there's some great stuff, but frankly, the schools and indeed Prime through its reports and so on provides a lot of that information. I think the value of the rankings is to have a consistent third-party additional form of reality check, if you like. And so it's an important driver for students. And then finally, I'd say, going back to my initial thoughts about diversity, notably around gender as well as international cohorts, both in faculty and students, I think there's a number of anecdotal examples where we've seen schools have moved in that direction, perhaps, hopefully, partly incentivized by the weightings that we give those factors. Ben, I think.
I think there's absolutely no doubt that rankings have had influence on the behavior of institutions, but not all rankings. You know, there seems to be a sense that if somebody puts a ranking together, it's going to immediately influence the behavior of institutions. But the ranking has to be well compiled, it has to have a following, it has to have the potential to influence the behavior and decision-making of the stakeholder group that matters to that institution, in order for the institution to take the outcomes of the ranking seriously and it modify their behavior. So we've had some rankings that have been extremely influential on behavior, and we've had other areas where we've tried to do rankings in specific areas, and because people are all focused on the big one over here that everyone's looking at, that hasn't necessarily had the kind of impact that we thought it might. We produce a ranking that's specifically around employability, for instance. And whilst the institutions that are very wired into that subject are really interested in it, the fact that it doesn't pick up the broad audience means that it doesn't have the influence on institutions that are not yet really thinking about that. And that's where we are with this, is we're interested in empowering the rankings that have already got a following and impact with measures and dimensions that intersect with these areas. So we have built in diversity metrics already into our program rankings for business schools. We are looking at how we can build in filters across our main ranking so that an interested prospective student that isn't necessarily thinking, I want to go to the greenest or the most sustainable university, but I want to go to the best university that is green or that is diverse or that is sustainable. That's a slight flip in the way that conversation is happening. The fact that sustainability is important hasn't reduced the expectation of prestige and traditional measures of quality also being important in that decision making. So we've definitely seen areas where institutions have changed their mission statement to pursue to chase down a ranking. But interestingly, to the positive is the other way. It's where we're able to engage with institutions and begin to absorb what's important to them. And I think the whole ranking space is becoming increasingly symbiotic as we lay things on the table and business schools and universities come to us with challenges that they're considering, and we try to put those things together to contribute a useful tool to people who are making decisions around business schools.
Thank you, Ben. Nikolai, I know that we started late and so we have more time. Maybe can you just confirm in the comments for me, please, how much more time we have? However much you say, I think we are running out of it. So I'm going to propose that we're going to combine question 2 and 3. And again, I'm going to ask the panelists to please keep your remarks for a minute because I'd love you to respond directly. Oh my gosh, Nikolai's saying 1 minute before the next plenary. I thought we were going to have more time. Oh, my apologies. I thought because we started late, we would get more time. Nikolai, what do you think? Can you argue for 10 more minutes for us? Maybe we can join the plenary a few minutes late. Maybe you can check on that. So the next question was, what changes do we need in business schools? And then the third was, what additional changes are you making to incent that? So we're going to join, but you're only going to have 10 seconds each. So Andrew, I saw in the comments that you said the biggest impact business schools could have would be to teach business across the institution. And you know I'm a passionate believer in that. So we're going to go with that for your answer of what change is needed. How might you measure that? What might a metric be? So you guys are down to 10 seconds each and then pass it to the next.
Well, it's very early days. I'm waiting for these magic numbers and suggestions. But I mean, clearly, it has to be about teaching quality. It has to be about the nature of the research. It has to be about the outcomes. Where do those students go afterwards? Do they make a difference in society? And how do recruiters value the relative students and schools that are teaching them different courses?
I might just suggest it's about the curriculum. How many minors or certificates do business schools offer that are accessible to students that aren't in the business school? I think that would be a simple quantitative measure. So there you go. I jumped in with a suggestion. Who do you want to go next?
Toby?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So just jumping to the last question really fast in 20 seconds. I think what we need to measure to really get at the nub of this is, number one, the impact that the graduates from the schools are having in the world. We'll have to figure out how to measure that, but there are methods. And to Ben's point, this needs to be wrapped up in one whole ranking. Students are not looking for piecemeal rankings; they want it all wrapped up together. And then third, as a softer issue, but I think important, to look at the alignment of the endowments, the investment endowments with sustainable development goal principles is sort of a litmus test that students are identifying as a top priority. Over to you, Ben.
I think that the thing that business schools need to do in this context most is probably set aside this sort of notional paradigm that we can teach business the old-fashioned way and then spend 10% of our time worrying about sustainability. The SDGs are so complex and big that it should be self-evident to anyone that this is a whole framework for rebuilding everything and resetting our paradigms from ground zero and infusing this thinking into everything that business schools and universities are doing.
Leaves me, I guess. So I'm going to take us back to SDG 4, which is, after all, quality education. And there are two aspects from SDG 4 which stand out. Firstly, education for sustainability. Absolutely, business schools need to build that into their curricula so that there is a grounding in that. It's not just about how you run businesses, it's how you run businesses sustainably in its rounder sense. That includes building in equity and equality across the world. And the second thing I think is what Julia just touched on, which is the other aspect of SDG 4, which is relevant: access to lifelong learning. Opening up the work that business schools are doing so that, particularly now we're thinking about COVID-19, it's not just a health crisis, it's also an economic crisis. How can business schools actively support our economies by providing that additional support that people are going to need right now?
Well, thank you. And I'm just going to add from my own point of view and drawing from what the positive impact rating has done so effectively, capture the student experience, the student perceptions of the commitment of their business schools to working hard and doing all the sorts of things that you've been talking about. So the mission of the school, the curriculum, the commitment of the faculty, and the engagement with the community in terms of opportunities to work on real projects, research, not just theoretical research, but engage undergrad students working on action research projects in the community, I think can have tremendous impact. So capturing some of that as well. Anyway, I wish we had so much more time. But on behalf of everybody on our chat forum and in the session today, thank you to all of you for being open to consider these changes for the, the changes you're continuing to make, because it really does take all of us, and it's an alignment of systems against common goals. So thank you to being open to the comments and contributing today. And I guess now we will all see you in the plenary.